Okay. So, first of all, good evening, everybody. I wanted to look tonight at some of the poetry of Yehuda Amichai. And as I mentioned in the email that I sent out, Amichai passed away in 2000. But in some ways, his poetry, and I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself. And his poetry really speaks to me very much today, and particularly in the current situation. And, um, as I also said in my email, I am not by any stretch of the imagination a scholar of poetry. I mean, I personally don't think I'm by any stretch of the imagination a scholar of anything, but I'm certainly not a scholar of poetry. But I did have one class in Hebrew poetry in grad school, and um, had the privilege of learning from Amichai for one class session. And so let me tell you, a little bit about his biography and then a little bit about this class because even though it was only, 1 hour or so of class, it made a big impression on me. So Amichai was born in Germany, in Würzburg in 1924. His birth name was Ludwig Pfeffer. He grew up in a learned Orthodox home, and he grew up in Germany speaking both German and Hebrew, which was not uncommon at the time among Zionist households and especially among Orthodox Zionists. His family fled Germany in 1935. They moved to Eretz Yisrael. They lived for about a year in Petah Tikva, which is near Tel Aviv, and then moved to Jerusalem. He received an Orthodox education, and at some point, and from the biographical material that I've seen, I don't know at what point he decided to leave Orthodoxy. Probably when he was in the British Army during World War II, and then in the Palmach, which was the it was that Palmach was separate from the Haganah. It was its own sort of free state defense force, mostly associated with the kibbutz movement and the left wing in particular. And then in '48, he fought in the Israeli army during the War of Independence. It was about that time that he changed his last name to Amichai, which means my people live. I suspect from his first name having been Ludwig that his Hebrew name was Yehuda all along, because a lot of, like, if your Hebrew name is Yehuda, I mean, people are often names that start with L, like my name is Chaim Leib, and my middle name, what my parents would have called my Hebrew name, although Leib is really Yiddish, and my English middle name is Lawrence. So I suspect that Ludwig, anyway, but because Leib is often Yehuda or Aryeh. But anyway, he studied at the Hebrew University. He became a teacher of literature, and he published his first book of poetry in 1955. But throughout his career, was also, and Israel's a small country, and especially back then, it was a really small country. I think you would have had trouble making a living as a poet. So he made his living as a college teacher of literature. Um, he won pretty much every literary prize that Israel has. And he was nominated several times for the Nobel Prize in Literature as well. Obviously, never won it. The class that I had in poetry was it was a class in Hebrew poetry that was taught in Hebrew, and there were only 8 of us out of the 40 students in my year whose Hebrew was good enough to take this class. Um, so the professor for this class was a, a poet by the name of P. Carmi. Now you say, what is his name? P. Carmi. Well, in Hebrew, he was known as Pet Carmi because his name, he grew up in Brooklyn, also in a Hebrew speaking family in Brooklyn. His father was an Orthodox rabbi, and his name originally was Carmi. Carmi was his first name, Carmi Charney, which would have been spelled with a het, shin, resh, nun, yud, or shit in Hebrew. And when people Hebraize their names, sometimes if they had a Hebrew first name, they just sort of flipped it. So he became known as Het Carmi or T Carmi in English. And he was also a prominent poet in Israel, although not of the level of prominence of Amichai, but they were friends. And Amichai came in one day to give a guest appearance, and we had to translate and interpret Amichai's poetry in the presence of the man himself, which was certainly, a little bit of a daunting task. But one thing that I remember from the class is that one of my classmates, and I don't remember the poem or the line or the interpretation, but he offered his interpretation as to the meaning of a certain line, not just the not the translation, but the significance, what it means. And then he says to Carmi, asked him, "Is that right?" Not Carmi, Amichai. He says, "Is that right?" And Amichai says, "It doesn't matter. Once I publish a poem and put it out there in the world, it belongs to the reader. Okay. And if you see it in there, it's in there. And it doesn't matter whether that's what I intended or not. If you see it in there, it's in there and it belongs to you as much as it belongs to me." And that has had a profound effect on how I read text in general, because it frankly, and I don't want to get bogged down, right? But there's a certain academic way of studying text which maintains that each text, each line, or each word has one and only one meaning. And the task of scholarship is to ferret out the true, correct, and original meaning, right? And that is not the Jewish way. That may be the academic way, but it's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is Shivim Panim LaTorah. The Torah has 70 faces, meaning that there's a variety of legitimate ways of interpreting any text. And even if they contradict each other, they can both be correct at the same time. And, Alan, I don't know to what extent this has resonance for, you know, originalism versus, living Constitution, or Joe, in how people look at jurisprudence. But I suspect that, there is some some relevance, to this as well. But it for me, I mean, I think that there is a difference between the way Jews have historically read text and the way, academics, particularly those who come out of this German Wissenschaft approach read text. And so, I think Amichai really liberated me to understand text in a very different way. So I'll pause here for just a second, in case there's any questions or comments about what I just did. But all right, if not, so I'm gonna share screen so we can all be looking at the poems together. And the poems that I selected for tonight, there were two criteria for selecting them. One is that I found them of interest, and the other is that they are available in English transliteration on the internet, so I could simply copy and paste rather than scanning or whatever. But I do have a book of Amichai's poetry, several hundred pages, several hundred poems, and depending on how long we stick with Amichai, I can scan and and turn that into PDFs and share that with you all as well. So let me bring up the first poem. All right, so this one is called The Diameter of the Bomb. Okay, and I'll just read it, and then we'll just dive in. The diameter of the bomb. The diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters, and the diameter of its effective range about 7 meters, with 4 dead and 11 wounded. And around these, in a larger circle of pain and time, 2 hospitals are scattered and 1 graveyard. But the young woman who was buried in the city she came from, at a distance of more than 100 kilometers, enlarges the circle considerably. And the solitary man mourning her death at the distant shores of a country far across the sea includes the entire world in the circle. And I won't even mention the crying of orphans that reaches up to the throne of God and beyond, making a circle with no end and no God. Thoughts, comments, questions? Like I said, I'm not a scholar of poetry. I'm just somebody who loves text and who loves Amichai. Yeah, Toby. Need to unmute. Unmute. Yeah, there we go.
No.
Oh, you were unmuted and now you're muted again. You're muted again.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead. That's all right.
I did watch a couple of programs that dealt with, they were both entitled The Celebration of Yehuda Amichai, and they were really very good. It was a group of the women, and also John Robert Alter, who translated the poems. So I got a few little tidbits from about this one particular poem, which seems, which I think they, is connects with me. And I would say that the first few lines um, just reflects what the military spokesman would have said about what happened in that particular incident.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever you have bombs, and we see it today, and wounded and dead, the harm goes way beyond the immediate happening, and family is affected, friends, just people reading the news. Um, and that those are the times when people wonder, where is God?
Right. I mean, you know, it, if you think about the current situation, right? I mean, as I've shared before, um, the grandson of one of my professors was among the 1,400 people murdered on October 7th. So I never knew him, but I knew his grandfather, and I've corresponded with his mother. And I mean, I knew his grandfather and his grandmother, but so I'm part of that circle too. Or yesterday, a young woman who was in the army who had made Aliyah from Atlanta was killed in the military. Um, and, the entire Atlanta community is sitting ship. And I have a lot of friends who are rabbis in Atlanta, and, including her rap. I mean, it's just, and that's true always, but I think it's especially true for us because, as I said before, right, any two Jews in the world know a third Jew in common, right? And so, you know, so I am 1 degree of separation from somebody who was killed on October 7th, right? Which makes all of you 2 degrees of separation. Um, and, we're really all interconnected. And that, so that circle of grief and mourning does, take in the whole world, right? And that's why, I mean, this is, I think, one of Amichai's more well-known poems. And it's one that people turn to, whenever there's a terrorist attack in Israel. But I like what you said really resonates to me is that, the first 3 lines are very clinical, right? And they could be, you know, the beginning of a press conference from the army spokesperson, or the prime minister's office or whatever, right? It's very cold and clinical and detached, right? But then it becomes, much more kind of human and personal, right? And that's the strength. It's one of, to my mind, one of the strengths of Amichai as a poet is he's able to move between different modes. And he's also able to be autobiographical in a way that is universal at the same time, right? And you say to, well, which bombing was this, and who's the young man? Who's the young woman? And who is the man in another country who's mourning? Is that her father? Is that her boyfriend? Is that her husband? I don't know, right? And but the biographical details don't really matter, right? It's the emotional details that speak to us, I think. Alan, you look like you have something that you want to say.
Oh,
You also need to unmute.
There we go.
Yeah.
Here's a new computer. I think that what Toby's talking about is the universality of after action reports and the news reports, but that what Amichai catches is that this is a very human situation, and he points to the different. He universalizes, because you know what? It doesn't even matter if the person involved is not Jewish, if the person involved isn't someone we know, because it's a universal human trait. And so I think that his genius is to be able to abstract this, but also to bring it down to a an individual level. And I think this is a great poem because of it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you're right. It doesn't have to be a Jew, and this could be a Palestinian family in Gaza right now too. And which is precisely what, for me, makes this such a difficult period of time, is that, I mean, he's talking about larger circles, larger circles, larger circles, right? And we all have concentric circles of concern and responsibility. It's 2 years ago this week that my dad passed away on the secular count. And and you were president at the time, and that I was, going up to New York to see my dad frequently. And, you never once said to me, Rabbi, if you want to see a dying old man, there are dying old men in hospitals here in Montgomery County too. Go see one of them, right? Well, yeah, I mean, I could go see a dying old man
But they're not your father.
but they're not my father, right? And do I care more about Israelis who are dying than Palestinians who are dying? Yeah, I do. Okay, because Israelis are my family and Palestinians are not my family, right? But if I don't care about the Palestinians who are dying at all, then I've lost my humanity, right? And but on the other hand, if I say that too loudly or too frequently, Rabbi, we thought you were a Zionist. Rabbi, we thought you were a loyal Jew. Rabbi, we thought you loved Israel, right? And it's, and I think we should, when we read something like this, be thinking about Israelis, but also thinking about Palestinians, because these circles and the pain that their loved ones feel, it's the same regard.
That's why, to be blunt about it, that's why sometimes when you say we stand with Israel, well, maybe you do. On many topics you do, but do you stand with Israel um, when they're dead wrong? And now and then they are.
Sure.
So these things are tricky.
Yeah, it's very tricky, and Amichai would have been the first one to agree with that. I mean, he a lot of his poetry was, I mean, including some of the things that I have here, an attempt to humanize um, the faces of Palestinians. I mean, frankly, they weren't even necessarily called Palestinians at the time that he wrote some of these poems. They were just called Arab. But um, Amichai for sure would have agreed with that as well. Um, Anybody else have any thoughts on this poem?
I just have one thought. That last
Yeah.
line, the last two lines, um, I mean, really stabs you in the heart, because after all this horror, you like to think somewhere there's an answer, somewhere there's a God, and it ends with "and no God."
Right.
So,
Yeah, I mean, thank you for. I mean, there's 2 points that I want to make, and one is I think you know about Amichai's biography, and another is about Hebrew. I mean, because people say, and I agree with that. I mean, people who have translated Amichai, right, and I mean, Amichai knew English well, but not enough to translate his own stuff, but he often worked with the translators. Um, but Amichai, having grown up Orthodox and become secular, and you know, born in Germany in 1924, and so I mean, I go back and forth between seeing him as the poet of the absence of God and a poet of anger at God, right? And sometimes I feel that he's saying God doesn't exist, and other times I feel he's saying God exists and I'm really pissed at him. And the two are not in contradiction. I mean, he had a 45-year career as a poet, and he could have felt, and sometimes people ask me, well, what do you believe? And I'll say, well, today I believe this, but tomorrow I might believe something different, right? So there's no contradiction there. But he is definitely, but that struggle with God is very Jewish. I mean, you look at last week's Parsha, right? Abraham argues with God, right? I mean, we're not, and even the name Israel, Yisrael, means the God struggler, right? That's in the very name of our people. Um, that sort of simple faith, and God said it, so you shut up. Who are you to challenge it? That's not the Jewish way. But all right, so no and circle with no end, right? In Hebrew, that would be Ein Sof, all right? And Ein Sof is one of the, right, which means in no end, but also like means infinite. And Ein Sof is one of the Kabbalistic terms for God, right? So even talking about a circle with no end and no God, it's still, right, there's a hint in there, in the Hebrew at least, to God. Take that for what it's worth. But there are certainly, look, I mean, there were certainly people in Israel, who vehemently objected to the honor that Amichai received because they considered him, blasphemous. And I know when I've taught Amichai's poetry before, there have been congregants, on the more traditional end of the spectrum who were shocked, that this is not, not high, right? But I mean, I frankly have no, I would rather people struggle with God, right, than anything else. I mean, I think we all have to struggle with God. And if you're not struggling with God, like I said, in my drasha last Shabbat, I said, if you're not abyssal mashiga lately, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not struggling with God, I think there's something wrong with you after the Holocaust, right? Gail.
So, as I was reading it, I mean, I know why you picked it, but the first thing I thought of was actually the bomb, the Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Right.
Mhm.
And the other thing was, you're talking about struggling with God. Well, we're about to read next we're gonna get to Isaac and Jacob, and obviously Isaac had some struggle or didn't struggle, for because of the
Right.
and then Jacob supposedly struggled with an angel, which could be a substitute for struggling again with God.
Right. Right. No, and I mean, Jacob is Yisrael, which is where the name comes from. Right. So, no, absolutely. Okay. So let's move on to a really blasphemous poem. Okay. God full of mercy. And really, really hard to translate. Okay. So it says, God full of mercy, the prayer for the dead. The Hebrew just says El Maleh Rachamim. Doesn't have to say the prayer for the dead, right? But El Maleh Rachamim literally means God full of mercy, right? But then the next line, if was not, in Hebrew is Il Maleh. Okay, so it's a pun, El Maleh, Il Maleh, right? And so Il Maleh, El Maleh Rachamim, right? Right. So that's, that's, again, it's really hard to translate and, helps if you understand some Hebrew. Okay. God full of mercy, the prayer for the dead. If God was not full of mercy, mercy would have been in the world, not just in him. I who pluck flowers in the hills and look down into all the valleys, I who brought corpses down from the hills, can tell you that the world is empty of mercy. I who was king of salt at the seashore, who stood without a decision at my window, who counted the steps of angels, whose heart lifted weights of anguish in the horrible contest. I, who use only a small part of the words in the dictionary, I, who must decipher riddles I don't want to decipher, know that if not for the God full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world, not just in him. Right. I mean, to me, it takes that concept El Malay Rachamim, right, and really turns it on its head, right? Turns it on its head, right? God is full of mercy, right? God is so full of mercy, right, that there's no mercy left for the rest of the universe. All of the mercy is in God, right? And it's very nice for God to be full of mercy, but how about a little mercy here in the world, here in the universe, right? But there's none left over, right? And I mean, whose fault is that? Right? I mean, Amichai would say it's, I think he would say that's God's fault, right? So this is, if the last poem was a poem of the absence of God, this poem, I think, is more a poem of anger at God, right? But well, I'll stop here. Again, Joe, go ahead.
Who is the king of salt?
I don't know. The only thing that I can tell you is that in Hebrew, king of salt is Melech Hamela, right?
Mhm.
So it's a pun, right? King of salt, Melech Hamela, and actually, one translation that I've seen captures that alliteration, and instead of translating it king of salt, translated it as sultan of salt, which may be a less literal translation, but I think captures um, the poetry. But I have no idea what you know what he's saying, none whatsoever. So your guess is as good as mine, right? Because once he put it, it's out there, and it belongs to you as much as it belongs to anybody else. Yeah, Gail. Still
Unmute.
muted.
Yeah,
I'm going to everybody just
So,
stay unmuted. We're a small enough group.
okay, so the king of salt at a seashore, you don't see the salt, but there's tons of it.
Right.
So maybe it's saying, this guy is looking down and it sounds like, I who brought corpses down and plucked flowers. So it sounds like he's somehow involved like in the funeral business or something.
Right.
And saying he's the king of salt, like he's really got all this destruction or care for the dead or something.
Right. But it could almost be the opposite too, right? Because if you're the king of salt, right, the rain falls, the salt is gone, right? Now he's at the shore of the sea, right? I mean, who did we read about also last week, right? Mrs. Lot, right? Who turned into a pillar of salt on the shores of the Dead Sea. Yam Hamela, right? In Hebrew, it's known as Yam Hamela, which means the salt sea or the sea of salt. It's not known as Yam Hamav, the sea of death. It's known as the sea of salt. Um, so if you're the king of salt, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess diamond makes a lot of money, but if you're the king of salt, I don't know. That to me, that's kind of like a title that doesn't have a lot of worth or value or permanence either. But I don't know.
But then again, salt is also tears.
Salt is
And
tears.
salt is tears, and if you bring it back to then you have tears and you cry again back to the death. But reading to the previous one, where you cry and there's no mercy.
Right. I mean that idea, salt as tears. I mean, there's a wonderful line from a poem by Yonatan Geffen. Okay, and I mean, it became a song. I know it only in Hebrew, and it's really hard to translate. But I'll say it in Hebrew, and then sort of. כשעצובים הולכים לים, לכן הים מלוע. Okay, and part of it, so when we are sad, we go to the beach. Okay, but in Hebrew, you don't say, you say holchim layam, we go to the ocean. All right, but so when we are sad, we go to the beach, and that's why the sea is salty.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? Uh, I, I mean, it's that same idea, right? Salt is tears, right? And the sea is salty because we go to the sea, we go to the beach when we're sad. It's not as profound as Amichai, but there's something to that as well. All right. We'll look at one more and then we'll take a break and we'll come back. I don't know, either next week or the week after, depends on what's going on. God has pity on kindergarten children. God has pity on kindergarten children. He pities school children less, but adults he pities not at all. He abandons them. And sometimes they have to crawl on all fours in the scorching sand to reach the dressing station. Again, really first aid station, to reach the first aid station, streaming with blood. But perhaps he will have pity on those who love truly and take care of them and shade them, like a tree over the sleeper on the public bench. Perhaps even we will spend on them our last pennies of kindness inherited from mother, so that their own happiness will protect us now and on other days.
Rabbi, one of the problems with these poems, especially the last one, there's a certain arrogance to it. Oh, I can explain the whole, and I don't think he means to do that. I think he's just giving us an insight. And secondly, what we have here is a very narrow thought, and you have to read it in context, and we don't always know the context. So I think it's fairly not esoteric, but I think it's fairly abstruse. And I think you could study it for quite a while and get themes from Amichai. But I don't know that this is the sort of thing that you can look at one time and say, oh, yeah, here we go. It's the road not taken. It's not.
Yeah.
It's much more philosophical. It's much more in line with the world, with trying to get adjusted to the world. And I think we would have to read it many, 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 many times and read some background material to get an idea what he's talking about. And then I don't know that it's, with all due respect, I don't know that it's worth it. Some of the things that he writes about are simple, but then again, if they're simple, there's a little more depth to them, and that's what makes them interesting. But I think this is really good because it makes us think in more universal terms. And that's what I think is the poet's real mission.
Right. I mean, again, I mean, to me, if I read this, okay, God, I mean, and it is shocking. I mean, it builds, right? He has pity on kindergarten children, less pity on elementary school children, and no pity on adults, right? But I mean, maybe he has pity, right? I mean, it's actually in Hebrew, it's the same word as El Malay Rachamim. Elohim mirachem al yaldei Hagam. Right? And you could have pity on them, but that's all you have, right? Because, I mean, where was that pity on October 7th? Right? And where is that pity in Gaza now?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, but again, I mean, you could have pity and that's all you, right? I mean, as if having the right feeling is a substitute for action, right? Like, frankly, so many of our friends on the far left, or one of our District 39 delegates. Um,
That was a good letter. That was a good answer.
Thank you. He didn't answer. But
He's capable of truly. It's a political statement, and
yeah,
so he's not going to convince you, and you're not going to give him money.
no. But so the biographical data doesn't matter, right? And as it happens, this poem was written in the 1950s. Okay, but it was written in the 1950s, and it speaks to us in 2023.
Well, he's got a certain universality.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another, like, but here's an interesting datum. Okay, when after Oslo in 94, Rabin, Peres, and Arafat shared the Nobel Peace Prize. And Rabin invited Amichai to read this poem at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Which to me says something about Rabin. That why did he do what he did with the Palestinians, right? Because he understood that, and look, I mean, he was certainly a warrior. I mean, he was chief of staff of the IDF in 67, right? He was not a pacifist. But, I think, and Alan, you can verify this, right? Nobody loves peace more than people who have military background
And have seen war.
and have seen war. Exactly. And if you've seen war, you know how stupid it is. But the fact that Rabin would say to Amichai, come read this poem at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, to me, says a lot about the soul and integrity of Rabin. Yes. And a year later, of course, he was murdered, right? And, one of the people who incited his murder is currently the Prime Minister of Israel. And another person who, as far as I know, was a co-conspirator is the current Minister of Domestic Security of the State of Israel. Okay, because I don't know if you know this about Itamar Ben-Gvir, but shortly before Rabin was assassinated, Ben Gvir stole the hood ornament off of Rabin's limousine. And he showed it around and he said, we got to his car, we'll get to him as well. All right. And these are the kind of people who are running Israel. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't talk about this from the Bema, but it's one of the, right? I mean, and it's one of the reasons why we have this war right now, because they were asleep at the wheel because they were protecting settlers in the West Bank instead of watching the border in Gaza.
And they were arrogant.
And they were arrogant.
And they started
exactly.
to believe their own lies. Oh, they can't
Yeah.
get us. Well, hello. Guess what? They did.
Yeah. But you know, but this is probably, I mean, there's an element of biography. They have to crawl on all fours in the scorching sand to reach the first aid station streaming with blood. Right? I mean, yeah, it's particular, but it's universal. I mean, it's probably Amichai's personal experience, but it's, you know, and look, thank God I've never experienced this personally, but I can imagine, you know, I can imagine what it's like. And, you know, there is a universality. I'm about to say, you know, I would like us, you know, I'll see if for next time I can find some happy poems of Amichai. I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, you know, it's like because they're so universal and because of, and again, I'll speak personal, right? The last 5 weeks have been, you know, incredible psychological struggle for me, you know, because especially because I have so many friends there, you know, and you know, I'm at an age where none of my friends are in the army, but now their kids are in, right? And I have a lot of friends, and I heard from somebody I know who's a member of a Hever Kadisha, a burial society, you know, because they have a woman's Hever Kadisha and a man's Hever Kadisha. And they are burying parts of bodies, right? I mean, parts of bodies. You know, and it's more than a month, and they haven't had all the funerals because they haven't identified all of the bodies. And it's just, and again, I mean, is it any different in Gaza? No, it's not, right? I mean, having said that, from my perspective, Hamas could end the war tomorrow by releasing the hostages.
Yeah.
Right? So all of those deaths are on Hamas, but that doesn't, you know, if my kid is dead, do I care whether it's Israel's fault or Hamas's fault or whoever's fault? My kid is dead, right? It doesn't. It doesn't matter, and you know, but that is anyway. I'm talking.
As long as it's war, I don't think you really want Robert Frost's kind of poems that that Amichai came up with. I think we need to think about difficult issues and come up with our own ideas and some insight about them.
Yeah, sure, and that's right. I mean, and this isn't about politics per se. It's about human emotions. You know, having said that, you know, caring about people who are not of your group is seen as a political statement. it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. But I mean, that is the human tragedy. Is that we tend to circle the wagons, and instead of concentric circles, we have just walls, right? And actually, one of his poems is about those walls. One of the poems that I brought here that we won't get.
I almost see these as two different poems kind of stitched together. I mean, the first two stanzas are very pessimistic, but then there's a more hopeful note in the middle.
Right. There is. There's
Yeah.
there's a that God may have pity on lovers, right? But it's only a hope, right? It's a
Right.
perhaps. And then there is, I mean, one of the ideas in Judaism that I find really helpful. I mean, it's not just in Judaism. I mean, it's in Christianity, they have it too. They call it imitatio Dei, right? But in Hebrew, it's mahu afata, right? That just as God visited the sick, right? That was in last week's Parsha. The angels came to Abraham, right? They came to Abraham right after his circumcision, right? Oh, just as God visits the sick, you should visit the sick, right? Just as God clothed the naked, when did God clothe the naked? When he made the garments of fig leaves for Adam and Eve. Just as God clothed the naked, you should clothe the naked. Just as God buries the dead, you should bury the dead. When did God bury the dead? When Moses. Right? So mahu afata, that these things are godly, and we should strive for godliness in our lives, right? So he goes from, absence of God, or at least absence of God's pity, to, all right, so maybe he will have pity on those who love, and mahu apata, right? Just as God does, so should we, right? Will have pity as well, and kindness, right? That we inherited from our mother, right? So it is, and you see this a lot in Amichai. It does move from
Almost despair to hope.
despair to hope, right? Which is, I mean, the prayer that we read for the captive, right? Right? From, captivity to redemption, or, the Haggadah, right? Matil b'ganut u'misayem b'sheva, right? We start with degradation, but we end with praise, right? Or, Tisha B'Av, right? Which is what we don't put on talis and tefillin in the morning, but we put it on in mincha, as right, that moving towards, from that movement from despair to hope, right? Very good pickup. I mean, it's I mean, as much as Amichai may be a blasphemer, right? He's an extremely Jewish blasphemer, right? I mean, there's no question. I mean, this is Jewish through and through. I mean, but at the same time, human and universal. It's both at the same time. All right. Thank you, everybody. This has been an interesting discussion, and I appreciate you all participating, because, as I said, I am far from a scholar of poetry, and you know, I'll decide in the next day or two. You know, I mean, if I'm talking about contemporary Jewish controversies, there's no talking about anything other than what's going on in Israel. And you know, the luxury of not living in Israel is that we can not talk about it too. Anyway, so we'll see. I mean, I'm inclined to think maybe we'll go on without. All right. Good night, folks.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
Right, thank
Nine.
Oh, that was a
All right,
good.
thank you.
you. Good discussion.
Thanks.